first presentation is by Kasun Ubayasiri, excuse me for mispronunciation, of Griffith University, Queensland, Australia. And Kasun is going to talk about Manus to Meanjin, a case study of refugee migration and polymorphic borders and Australian imperialism. Looking forward to it. Over to you, Kasun.
Hi, Henry. Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'll do is I'll run this as a video. I think hopefully this should work. He says because I've recorded it, and I think that should. We at Griffith are on Teams, so this is a slightly okay. This should work. Okay, all right. So should share that.
Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I sit in,
Yes.
the young people, the elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Greetings from balmy Brisbane. This traditional research presentation centers around a post hoc theorization of a photojournalistic project on refugee and asylum seeker protests at Kangaroo Point Detention Centre in Brisbane between the 2nd of April 2020 and the 14th of April 2021, and the long form slow journalism of documenting the immigration narratives over the past 2 years throughout the protests and beyond. So with such theorization, the experience of Kangaroo Point refugees can be viewed against a backdrop of Australia's neo-colonialism, where successive Australian governments have used its former colonies in Nauru and Manus Island in PNG as offshore detention facilities. Now, which in reality means a dumping ground of refugees. This neo-colonial imagining presents a biopower that defines and shapes both the refugees and the inhabitants of these former colonies, and indeed the current colonies we have, which is Queensland, for one, where I sit in, through a dispersed network of securities, territories, and borders. So this presentation will first look at a brief overview of the KB project and the protest itself, which is at the heart of this photojournalism project, before looking at three elements of the post hoc theorization I spoke of: the polymorphous nature of the Australian border, the Homo Sacer biopower idea of refugees, and the neo-colonial imagining of the Pacific as a refugee dumping ground. These theoretical matters will be discussed, of course, in concert with the presentation of the photojournalistic and documentary outputs produced throughout this project. The story, because at the end of the day, this started as a journalistic project, this story, or part of this story, begins on July 19th, 2013, when the Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, declared that no asylum seeker arriving by boat would settle in Australia. Asylum seekers arriving by boat after this point, including some who had already been at sea when the announcement was made, was scooped up by the Australian Navy, processed on Christmas Island, and sent off to offshore detention. They were mostly sent to indefinite incarceration on offshore detention centres in Nauru and Manus Island, PNG. While a bit under a third were granted bridging visas in mainland Australia. It's nearly impossible to ascertain who exactly was affected by this, because the demographic data of refugees and asylum seekers in Australia's various detention centres is not easily accessible. And even at a political level, there is very little transparency. So the information we have comes from drip feeding through the Senate estimates hearings. For example, in response to a question by the Green Senator, Nick McKim, the Immigration Border Protection Portfolio noted in March 2017 that between July 19, 2013 and the last port arrival, which captures this period, July 27, 2014, 79 boats had arrived in Australia. They argue that there had been no boat arrivals for 950 days, and that's another conversation. Of the individuals on board these boats, 1,596 were transferred to Nauru Regional Processing Center, 1,523 were transferred to the Manus Regional Processing Center, and 414 were issued a bridging visa in Australia. And the decision to grant a bridging visa for some and not others is explained as the minister exercising his non-delegable personal power. The process remains opaque. The resultant statistics are stripped of even the most basic humanizing demographic information. This bureaucratic dehumanization often assigns people to a processing number based on their three-letter boat identification, PIN 049, for example. Reiterating that the Australian government considered and reiterates that the Australian government considers their stay as temporary, they are referred to as transitory persons. So they kind of what seems stark is the Australian government's apparent refusal to acknowledge these migrants as asylum seekers or refugees. An Iranian refugee who was sent to Christmas Island and from there to Manus and from there to Kangaroo Point. So the Australian government did everything they could to refer to them, not to refer to them as refugees or asylum seekers. I was a client on Christmas Island, a transferee on Manus, a resident after the Supreme Court ruling that ruled against this incarceration of refugees, and a detainee at Kangaroo Point. So this post hoc exploration of the visuality of Kangaroo Point protest then can be unpacked through both theoretical imagining of the experience and through the methodological considerations that bring that experience into sharp focus. The theoretical considerations in this respect lies around the nature of Australia's borders itself as polymorphic entities instead of a singular omnipresent barrier separating inside and outside of Australia. The nature of power, or rather the exercise of biopower in the inclusion and exclusion of individuals from that border. And this idea of biopower, of course, comes from the Foucauldian interpretation and more precisely through Giorgio Agamben's concept of Homo Sacer, humans reduced to bare life. The methodological considerations I speak of course, rests on looking at this refugee migration and exclusion across the border through a spatial term, understanding the space and place, and in construction of the construction of national identity and critical geography, which comes from the construction of national identity and critical geography, and the capacity of the visual term, the power of the image to give salience to this kind of analysis. The physical locus of the project, of course, as I said, is centered around the compound in Brisbane's Kangaroo Point, and as such, it should be the locus of this post hoc theorization as well. That said, the KP Airport cannot be divorced from the wider imagining of the nature of boundaries and borders and the conceptualization of space on either side of the border and the exercise of biopolitics across it. So let's look at this nature of a polymorphous border first. The boundaries of Kangaroo Point Central Hotel, which is the detention center, presents a classic example of this polymorphous border, porous for some, yet impervious to others. Such a concept of borders is particularly relevant in the mediated representation of this refugee crisis, which is what I've been doing as a journalist, where the men on the balcony physically standing inside the suburban hotel in Brisbane, in Australia, are in many ways still positioned outside of Australia itself and somewhere in limbo between their last location on Manus or PNG, Manus Island or in PNG, or their next destination, which remains unknown. This imagining of the nature of boundaries is also significant in understanding the challenging, the strong border rhetoric, in understanding and challenging the border rhetoric that is presented to us by successive Australian governments. So for 80 or 90, what meant for these people was that for 80 or 90 guards, Serco security, Serco guards, guards and Serco staff coming in and out of this compound, this speciality of the perimeter wall mainly represented an outer boundary of their workplace. For the Australian anti-detention protesters during the protest, this represented a boundary of a private property across of which, crossing would be considered trespass. For the refugees inside the border, an arbitrary line marking their in-betweenness in a sort of immigration departure lounge, neither here nor there. Some of these men will technically never step foot on Australian soil, however, how many walls they scale or how many borders they cross. The federal government border checkpoints, the subcontracted through Serco Security and Queensland State Police, demonstrated further evidence of this respecialization of state sovereignty and the polymorphic interpretation of the border, where the border no longer represents an unbroken edge of the territory of, or the sovereignty projected by traditional narratives as cohesive, monstrous, omnipotent, and omniscient. Yet the highly contextual polymorphous nature of the border also prevents the complete collapse of the federal government's strong border rhetoric, even when the border is temporarily besieged in times of protests. Such incursions are dismissed as matters of law and order under the state jurisdiction instead of border incursions under federal law. So it's not a single concept, but many ideas bundled into one. The next big theoretical concept around this is the idea of the Homo Sacer, a refugee as an outsider. So the idea of refugee as Homo Sacer rests on the exploration and unpacking of the narrative and of narratives and symbols produced and created by governments with the explicit purpose of shaping national identity. So drawing upon Agamben's notion of sovereign power that defines and shapes meaning and inclusion and exclusion, the spatial and conceptual positionality of refugees can be situated through the images of borders and the representation of identity and belonging through citizenship and legitimation or illegitimation of migration. In theorizing biopower, Agamben draws on this Roman concept of a Homo Sacer, paradoxical figure, banished outside of the political sphere and reduced to a state of bare existence, one who can be killed with impunity, yet not even sacrificed to the gods. The Australian detention regime on and offshore detention centres, immigration transit accommodations, alternate places of detention, presents this ambiguous space where the Australian state sovereignty delineates membership, delegates non-members outside of this political society of the Australian citizenry. This exclusion in the case of the refugees and asylum seekers who arrived by boat after the 19th of July 2013 represents a immigration transit purgatory where they await the ultimate physical removal from outside of Australia's polymorphous border, either through repatriation to their own countries, thus risking refoulement, or removal to a permanent settlement in a third location, or being stuck in this limbo. In the case of a third location settlement, this, in the case of the US in particular, this is a refugee exchange, a bartering, which we'll be talking in a moment. The state narratives and symbols that frame refugees seeking asylum as queue jumpers, illegals, continue to justify their exclusion from society through suppositions of deviance and criminality that are never openly discussed or legally proven. The ability to erroneously criminalize refugees justifies the exertion of biopower, continued exertion of biopower, and the imagining of or legalization or the justification of immigration limbo. The Homo Sacer refugee is removed, bartered, and at the whim and pleasure of the state without any real agency to determine their own fate. At least 12 refugee and asylum seekers have died through suicide while in Australian detention on Manus and Narrow, and many more even after they've been settled. Yet, as Homo Sacers outside the Australian citizenry, their deaths are rarely registered as a state responsibility. Experience of suicidal ideations are common among refugees. and detainees in these facilities. And in an ultimate exhibition of biopower, the state continues to prolong their life in immigration purgatory, securitizing mental health and preventing the capacity even for suicide through rigorous civic security measures instead of offering psychological remedies through permanent solutions for their to their indeterminate status, which is essentially what drives the psychological trauma. The last component of this is this of offshore detention is essentially is the Australia's sub-imperialism, this superiority complex of Australia in looking at the Pacific. The nationalist imagining of Australianness continues to be deeply seated in this colonial identity that we're better, that Australia, by sending people to PNG and Manus, there would be lesser places, places less attractive to people. So it's a superiority complex that comes from this Australian, identity, colonial identity, both in the ongoing colonization of Aboriginal land and the colonial proxies of the British colonial proxies of the British Crown and neo-colonial views of neighbouring Pacific region. Now, Australian historian Humphrey McQueen argues that for much of Australia's history, the colonists who occupied the continent as an outpost of the British Empire, having in return viewed the neighbouring Pacific region through Australia's own version of a Monroe Doctrine, exhibiting some sub-imperialist tendencies, first as a group of pre-federated British colonies and later as federated neo-colonists, where the colonial dominion of the Pacific shifted from Britain to Australia, and this continues. We'll talk about this briefly in a moment. This so-called Pacific solution is a classic example of this kind of mindset. So to briefly talk about the Pacific solution, it was first introduced by John Howard and had bipartisan support until it was dismantled by the first Rudd government in 2007, between 2007 and 2010. But Labor was flirting with this idea of Pacific offshore processing very quickly after that. Again, in 2012, the Labor Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, was once again talking about a Howard type of offshore processing and returning to Manus and Nauru after the High Court rejected her proposal to exchange asylum seekers who came to Australia for processed refugees in Malaysia. Again, we see this idea of that, tagging of that Homo Sacer kind of concepts of, people who are legitimate, people who are illegitimate, and just bartering and tagging people. That's a conversation perhaps for another time. So, in July 2013, the second Rudd government signed an agreement with PNG to permanently settle refugees in PNG, which is the starting point of the conversation of the protests at KP, the final ruling that people would not be settled if they come by boat to Australia. So the Abbott government that came into power after Rudd takes this to another level. They implement Operation Sovereign Borders, touting a zero tolerance policy towards asylum seekers arriving by boat and changing the terminology, militarizing it in some ways, but also making it, criminalizing this. And whereas the previous government spoke of irregular maritime arrivals, now they talk of illegitimate maritime arrivals. So again, we see this idea of criminals, people who are deviant and criminal, and so they're dumped in the Pacific, and because we don't want them coming to Australia and polluting our way of life. The Pacific is dispensable because of our colonial imagining, and again, this colonial imagining has very deep roots, and we need to see this within the context of going back even before Australia was formed. So successive Australian governments using this PNG and Nauru as dumping grounds is kind of well rooted in this mindset. So as far back as 1883, the Queensland's pastoral premier decided to unilaterally plant a flag in Port Moresby and annex Port Moresby to Queensland. And by 2019, Australia had essentially done this, fulfilled a long term ambition, the newly federated Australia annexing PNG under the Treaty of Versailles. Now, in short, Australia's policy of sub-imperialism centers around securing domain over PNG, while maintaining this ethnic purity of white Australia by limiting migration, keeping people at bay. The PNG, while PNG was granted an independence by Whitlam in 1975, this relationship of a master-servant relationship has, or at least on Australia's part, this mindset has continued. So Australian colonisation of Nauru runs along similar lines, with the exception of New Zealand coming into this space as through its own sub-imperialistic ideals. So this complex asymmetric partnership with Nauru and PNG is central to framing and mediating this political reality of contemporary refugee migration in Australia through and its use of former Pacific colonies, through the promise of aid or the withholding of aid to use as a buffer against irregular refugee migration. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this presentation and me trying to tackle into a very short period of time to stay on the right side of my time allocation. I would love to have longer conversations with people. If you want to if you like, please feel free to contact me, and hope this is the start of a conversation, and hope to talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
All right. So
thank you very much, Kasun. That was a wonderful presentation. Very theoretically informed, with lots of factual information documenting a very politically charged context of islands being used as human dumping grounds. If anybody has a question, if you click on the reactions at the bottom right of the screen, you can put your hand up and we'll just work your way through, or you can put something in the chat if it's a comment to Kasun or a question, or you might be able to answer it later on. So we'll just take a few questions. Yuki, would you like to ask a question?
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I was just thinking about what you said about the Pacific solution, and I find it really interesting that the Pacific solution, in a way, is a form of debt trap to PNG and Nauru. But what I find it really interesting is where the Australian government accuses of China being, presence in the Pacific as a form of debt trap, when Australia itself uses debt trap through the Pacific solution. And I was just wondered whether you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on. I think it's again that very, very briefly, I think it's again that neo-colonial idea. It is the Pacific is ours to exploit, not theirs to exploit idea, right? So is the Chinese incursion is seen as the Pacific doesn't have agency. It is China coming in. I mean, whether the Pacific the relationship with China is good or bad is a decision for the Pacific. It's a mistake for Pacific nations to make. It's not for Australia's patronizing kind of we'll stay off our Pacific kind of idea while we exploit it. And I think that's an extension of that kind of parental oversight kind of way Australia thinks about this place, while exploiting it ruthlessly over the last 200 years.
Thanks, Kasun. Oh, unmute Henry.
Yeah, Valia,
Sorry.
you do have a question?
Yeah, well, it's more of, that was a really very rich presentation, and I felt like I think this is my post-lunch, very quickly eaten, sort of, really felt it was very rich in concepts, the sub-imperialism, the Australia's polymorphic borders, the federated neo-colonialism. And I was wondering, how is the island situated in these offshore detaining centers concept. There was a comment there in one of the photos that you had put. We were told that people in this part of PNG were cannibals. So how is the island presented by Australia, the policies, the government? Yeah.
I think that, see, this is one of the problems of where I'm located and where this project is located. I think the voice that comes through is the refugee interpretation of the island as opposed to the islanders' view of the island. And I'd love to kind of go and spend a bit of time thinking about that on the islands itself, which is tricky because of the way all of these things are structured. But I think that was exactly what they were doing. I think these were two groups of people who were outside of Australia's interest, or Central Australia, that kind of, to kind of put it in a very crude sense, it's still that white Australia. It's us on this side and them on that side. And when this othering doesn't really care, but at the same time, it tries to keep the different groups of others separate, and them that kind of mistrust there, so that, because the people on the other side all have something in common, they realize Australia's lack of concern and empathy for their well-being. So the best way to Australia to kind of stop that cohesion, for that partnership, is to keep them kind of slightly suspicious of one another. And I think that was these things, as these things don't happen they're not sort of, structured, strategies that are delivered. These are mindsets that kind of create and fester. And so I'm not saying that the Soca guards were given a kind of a script to say, well, this is what you need to do, but this is the kind of people we recruit. This is the kind of mindset we have. And this is exactly what these guys were saying, because when they were, most of these people, they're Iranians, they're from, other part of the world that has really doesn't know much about the Pacific, let alone Australia. So this was uncharted territory for them. These aren't people who could say, well, this is where I am. And they were educated people who kind of, came from very cosmopolitan Middle Eastern backgrounds, and there were people who had been refugees throughout their whole life, going from camp to camp, from Somalia and places like that. So all of these groups, once you kind of drop them in PNG, I think their narrative was, they said they were told that the islanders were criminal. They told me that once they finally found their way to the islanders and struck a relationship, they realized that the islanders had been told that the people in these camps were criminals and be afraid of them. And the refugees were told these people are savages and cannibals and whatever. So be very careful of them. So that was this kind of way of, I think it's a very brutal psychological way of maintaining that border for practical reasons, because they kind of go, okay, well, they're not going to join forces and outnumber us. So the real part of the answer is, I don't have a proper answer for it beyond that, but I'd love to, because the refugees, because they spend a lot of time there, and then so they have meaningful relationships and friends back in PNG. And there are some people who even go, look, I'm done with Australia. I'm happy to go back to PNG. I had a better life there. So it'd be really interesting part of that project. Yeah.
Okay, well, many thanks, Kasun. If we could just show our sign of appreciation. You can hear and see people clapping.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henry.
Wonderful presentation. Personally, I'd like to look more into state multiculturalism, but that's maybe a discussion later on.